beginning in verse 12. Then all the multitude kept silence, and gave audience to Barnabas and Paul, declaring what miracles and wonders God had wrought among the Gentiles by them. And after they had held their peace, James answered, saying, Men and brethren, hearken unto me. Simeon hath declared how God at first did visit the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. And to this agree the words of the prophets, as it is written, After this I will return, and will build again the tabernacle of David, which is fallen down, and I will build again the ruins thereof, and I will set it up, that the residue of men might seek after the Lord, and all the Gentiles upon whom my name is called, saith the Lord, who doeth all these things. Known unto God are all his works from the beginning of the world. Wherefore my sentence is that we trouble not them which from among the Gentiles are turned to God, but that we write unto them that they abstain from pollutions of idols, and from fornication, and from things strangled, and from blood. For Moses of old time hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day.
All right, let me read the same verses. And all the crowd was silent, and were listening to Barnabas and Shaul, declaring how many miracles and wonders Elohim did among the nations through them. And after they were silent, Yaakov answered, saying, Men, brothers, listen to me. Shimon has declared how Elohim first visited the nations to take out of them a people for his name. And the words of the prophets agree with this, as it has been written. Reading from Amos chapter 9, verses 11 and 12, After this I shall return and rebuild the booth of David, which has fallen down, and I shall rebuild its ruins, and I shall set it up, so that the remnant of mankind shall seek Yahweh, even all the nations on whom my name has been called, says Yahweh, who is doing all this, who has made this known from of old. Therefore, James says, I judge that we should not trouble those from among the nations who are turning to Elohim, but that we write to them to abstain from the defilements of idols, and from whoring, and from what is strangled, and from blood. For from ancient generations Moshe has in every city those proclaiming him, being read in the congregations every Sabbath. Now this is one of those portions of text that, as we've looked at it, we've looked at this chapter thus far, we have to consider what is being called the decision or the judgment of the Jerusalem Council. Now James is the half-brother of Yeshua, having the same father and mother as the rest of his brothers, Jude, Joses, and the sisters that are referred to throughout the scriptures, but not having the same father as Yeshua.
Amen.
Same mother, but different father. And so he's a half-brother. We're going to look at his epistle, the epistle of James. We're going to look at the epistle of John. We're going to look at Peter or Shimon's or Cephas' epistles. But what we want to consider in this portion of Scripture, because many seem to believe that these are the only 4 commandments that were given to the New Testament church. And in particular, I'm referring to verse 20.
Right.
Where James says, But we write to them to abstain from the defilements of idols, in other words, idolatry, to abstain from whoring or sexual impurity, to abstain from what is strangled, because they're not to eat blood, and from specifically blood altogether. So many people are under the false assumption that these are the only 4 commandments. I've had conversations with brothers, over the years about this, people that I went to church with, respected, listened to in any kind of scriptural discussion, who currently still have that understanding, that misunderstanding. And the reason I'm saying that is because that's what they've told me. They've clearly said, Ron, you can't be saying that we're supposed to observe the commandments that are in the Old Testament. Clearly, the Jerusalem Council, they say, has given 4 commandments for the Gentiles, of which we are, unless we can trace our lineage back to Yehuda or back to Yisrael. You can't be saying that we're supposed to observe all the commandments. And they'll go as far as to say, because Jesus, they refer to him as, that's his Greek name, rather than the name that was given him, and that's Yeshua. He clearly did away with the commandments. Well, we know that's not the case. We've already looked at Matthew chapter 5 about what Yeshua said, until heaven and earth pass away. Not one jot or tittle from the law and the prophets will be done away with. So we know that's not true, but it's a false assumption. It's been suggested and taught in pulpits and in churches for a long time. And, if you tell falsehood or error long enough and specific enough and adamantly enough, people begin to believe it as a truth. We're seeing that today, even in what is supposed to be reported as the news.
Exactly.
And so things that are not true are being told, and things that are not true and being told are being believed. And we have to look at this portion of Scripture with that same kind of a microscope here. So if that's the only 4 commandments that we're supposed to observe, that were carryovers and implemented here by the Jerusalem Council, then it's okay to go ahead and murder.
What other assumption can you come to, given that kind of perspective on what it says?
So it's okay to lie. It's okay to steal.
But we know it's not, and they know it's not.
But you see, the error in that thinking is you keep trying to focus and say, no, we're not supposed to observe the commandments, just these 4, when in 10 seconds we blew that argument completely out of the water. No, it's not okay to lie. It's not okay to cheat. It's not okay to steal. It's not okay to murder. It's not okay to disrespect your parents. It's not okay to observe the Sabbath on another day other than the one that's been commanded. No, it's not okay. And yet it's that same mentality that people are using in a kind of a futile attempt to legitimize lawlessness, which is the rejection of the law or the commandments, and still just relegate it to these 4. However, even these 4 come from the Torah.
Exactly. You have to come to a conclusion that when you're reading some of these, even, for example, here in chapter 15, where you were reading from verses 16, 17, and 18, that is from the book of Amos, that is the foundation of this. He's saying that he's going to build his house, and the foundation of that is in the prophets. So if the prophets then, therefore, have been done away with, you have to set that aside and say, well, that really doesn't mean what it meant when it was originally said.
Yeah, I know it. And you have to set a lot of things aside. The other thing that comes to my mind when I'm hearing people say those are the only 4 commandments that we're supposed to keep is they're also, now they've begun to call Yeshua not only a false teacher, but a liar.
Exactly.
Because as written in Matthew's version of the life and ministry of Yeshua in chapter 22, he's questioned by a lawyer about the Torah. And in verse 36, he says, "Teacher, which is the great command in the Torah?" And Yeshua said to him, "You shall love Yahweh, your Elohim, with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your mind. This is the first and great command. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." So he goes on and says, on these 2 commands hang all the Torah and the prophets.
That seems pretty clear.
Very clear. But again, that's misunderstood. Because I've heard people interpret his last statement there in verse 40, on these 2 commands hang all the Torah and the prophets, is that that's all we have to do. We just have to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, strength, being, etc., and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And anything beyond that, we don't have to. Well, wait a minute. What just happened to the 4 that we just read in Acts chapter 15?
Yeah, that doesn't fit.
No, there's no place in Acts 15:20 where it says any reference to what Yeshua just said in Matthew 22. And the taught ones were there. So they would have known what was being said by Yeshua in Matthew 22. And they would also, Kepha in particular, or Shimon, Peter, he would know, wait a minute, no, you guys forgot one. Messiah said that we're supposed to love Elohim with all our heart, all our being, all our mind, and to love our neighbor. That's not mentioned in Acts 15. So which is it? Is it the 4 in Acts 15, or is it just the 2 in Matthew 22?
You know, when you really think about these men who were his taught ones that he came to and said, come follow me, and they made radical decisions to leave home and family and everything they had to follow him. If he had been a teacher who was propagating not observing the commands of Torah, would they have done that?
No, that wouldn't have been something that would have been practiced. Matter of fact, it would have been condemned. So that leads me to another question. So I have to ask the question, did Yeshua introduce commands to replace those previously given? In other words, there are people today that are saying that Jesus came and he instituted a new set of standards, a new commandments. And as we looked at...
They call it the law of Christ.
They call it the law of Christ. And the text they use is Matthew 5, where he says, you've heard it said, but I say to you, in such an erroneous manner that they're actually pitting the commandments given in the Torah against the commandments that are supposedly given by Messiah, by Yeshua. wait a minute, we've got a problem here if that's the case. So what we need to do is answer that question. Did Yeshua introduce commands to replace those previously given? Maybe that's something that you've heard said. We've already considered Matthew 5:17. We know that's not the case. But let's look real quick at John and his version of the ministry, life and ministry of Yeshua in chapter 14. And in chapter 14 of John, I'll pick it up at verse 15. Yeshua is speaking. He says, "If you love me, you shall guard my commands. And I shall ask the Father, and he shall give you another helper to stay with you forever, the Spirit of truth, whom the world is unable to receive, because it does not see him or know him. But you know him, for he stays with you and shall be in you. I shall not leave you orphans. I am coming to you. Yet a little while, and the world no longer sees me, but you shall see me, because I live, and you shall live. In that day you shall know that I am in the Father, and you in me, and I in you. He who possesses my commands and guards them, it is he who loves me, and he who loves me shall be loved by my Father, and I shall love him and manifest myself to him." Yehuda, not the one from Kerioth, said to him, "Master, what has come about that you are about to manifest yourself to us and not the world?" Yeshua answered him, "If anyone loves me, he shall guard my word, and my Father shall love him, and we shall come to him and make our stay with him. He who does not love me does not guard my words, and the word which you hear is not mine, but of the Father who sent me. These words I have spoken to you while still with you. But the Helper, the set-apart Spirit, whom the Father shall send in my name, he shall teach you all and remind you of all that I said to you." Lot here, but I want to just draw on a couple of things. I want you to notice in the first verse that I read, verse 15, "If you love me, you shall guard my commands." It appears that Yeshua is saying these are his commands. We have to back up to the first chapter of John, in the first verse of the first chapter. And we have to once again remember who Yeshua is. In the beginning, Yeshua is who? We know that he is clearly the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word, speaking of Yeshua, was with Elohim, and the Word was Elohim. Now that's not just a generic phrase in reference to words being spoken, because verse 2 says, "He," speaking of Yeshua, "was in the beginning with Elohim." So when Yeshua now comes on earth as a person, and he refers to himself as my commands, these aren't the first time these commands were spoken.
Exactly.
These are the commands that were spoken by the Word in support of the Father, confirmed by the Father, that confirmation being given by the sending from the Father, the Spirit of truth, not the spirit of a liar or a imitator or a duplicator, but the Spirit of truth to confirm that these words, and Yeshua clearly says it in verse 24, "And the word which you hear is not mine, but of the Father who sent me." So even as Yeshua and the Father are one, not only distinct in personage, they are the Father, the Son, and the set-apart Spirit, but they are one in unity. There is a difference in office. The Father is above all. Yeshua is directly under the Father, and the set-apart Spirit is directly under Yeshua. We know that exists, that hierarchy exists, and in the oneness of Elohim. Elohim being a plural reference to the three of them in this application of it. And so Yeshua is saying, if you guard my commands, if you guard my word, if you keep my commands, if you keep my word, if you guard my word will stay in you, you will stay in me. There is this application of oneness in ministry and purpose, and we see that demonstrated and expressed in this very portion of the Scriptures.
When he says guard my commands, that's the relationship kind of thing that he's talking about specifically. And if we look into John chapter 17, when Yeshua prays for his taught ones, and that would include us, he says in verse 16, "They are not of the world, as I am not of the world." In verse 17, and he's praying to his Father, our Father, "Set them apart in your truth. Your word is truth." So the very basis of our being called taught ones, being set apart, or as is commonly used in traditionalism, being holy, is in the word of the Father.
Yes, the originator, the one in supreme authority. So Yeshua being the Word that came in the flesh is simply confirming the Word that existed among and between he and his Father.
Amen.
That same Word that is the expression of the set-apart Spirit. In verse 24 of John chapter 14, according to the ministry of the Spirit, Yeshua very clearly says, "He who does not love me does not guard my words." So if he is the Word, as John 1:1 clearly states that he is, and he was the Word who spoke the commandments the first time, all he's doing here in John 14 is referencing those words. Because Yeshua's ministry on earth begins and is recorded in these 4 versions of his life and ministry, the words that he'd be referring to at any point included those that he spoke prior.
Amen.
Now, any reasonable thinking kind of a person is going to come to that conclusion. However, what we've been told over the years is that at the beginning of Matthew, that ended everything before. And now the life and ministry of Yeshua supersedes and replaces everything that was stated, every commandment that was given, every law that was spoken, once Yeshua dies. You see, they believed, and as we do, that Yeshua had to walk according to the commandments to prove that he was the sinless, atoning sacrifice, the Lamb of Yahweh. He had to walk sinless. The commandments are those words that are given that identify what sin is.
Right.
So when you break a commandment, you've sinned. So they understand that, we understand that, but then they take it further. The traditionalist mindset takes it further and says that the commandments were only good through the life of Messiah, and once Yeshua died and was resurrected, then those commandments that were written before are no longer applicable to any of those who follow him.
Exactly. So I understand that they believe that, but you're quoting out of John. If you look at his first letter, his first epistle that he wrote, he said very clearly in there that we are to walk as Messiah walked.
Yep.
So how does that fit?
It doesn't fit at all. As a matter of fact, what the suggestion is in what I proposed is that the traditional mindset says that the commandments have been done away with, or that Yeshua instituted a new standard, a new set of commandments, is also in opposition to the commandments that were once given. And what I'm referring to, Banner, is in Deuteronomy chapter 13. Starting in verse 1, when there arises among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and he shall give you a sign or a wonder. Now, Yeshua did plenty of signs and wonders. He's no question a prophet. He's much more than a prophet. So this would apply in measuring his ministry as well. Verse 2, and the sign or wonder shall come true, of which he has spoken to you, saying, let us go after other mighty ones, which you have not known, and serve them. Do not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for Yahweh your Elohim is trying you to know whether you love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and with all your being. Here's the application of the proper application of loving Yahweh or loving God, the traditional mindset would say, with all your heart and all your soul, is right here in Deuteronomy 13.
Right.
And it's to keep the commandments of Yahweh. It's in direct relationship with the commandments of Yahweh. That's how you prove that you love the commandment giver with all your heart and all your soul.
And so the very words that Messiah speaks is totally disconnected from when it was first given. And he's actually quoting from something that was already said long ago.
That he said long ago.
That he said long ago. So that disconnect, I wonder sometimes, because I've heard it said by some that the problem that we have, you and I and people who believe the way we believe, is we don't understand rightly dividing the word. And literally what they mean by that is they believe the divide came at the beginning of Matthew.
I know it. That's the wrongly divided application. So when Yeshua is referencing how to love Yahweh with all your heart and being, it's in direct relationship with keeping his commands.
Right.
Because in verse 4 of Deuteronomy 13, it's written, walk after Yahweh, your Elohim, and fear him, and guard his commands, and obey his voice, and serve him, and cling to him. And then he says, and that prophet, or that dreamer of dreams, is put to death. The one that is, for example, suggesting that the commandments of Yahweh are done away with, and now we have a new set of commandments that would cause people to follow a new mighty one?
Well, that's a pretty problematic kind of a thing that you're talking about, because if what is being propagated by traditionalism that the Messiah, they say, did, that puts him in opposition to that command.
Well, it certainly does. What has taken place, in my estimation and understanding of just watching this thing evolve, is they've fabricated a new Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
He's one who did away with the commands.
Right.
He's one who instituted his own. He's one who is not expecting those who follow him to follow the same commandments that he followed, that he walked in obedience, proving that he was a sinless atoning sacrifice, the Lamb of Yahweh.
I mean, that is what they're saying.
I believe that's exactly what they're saying, and it's a very serious problem.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Because
that's an accusation to the very Messiah that they say that they follow.
Yeah.
They're accusing him of lawlessness, of being a sinner, of being a liar.
Yeah. So I've asked three questions so far. Are these four in Acts 15 the only commands to obey? We found that that's not even true just from the what would be referred to by some as the New Testament scriptures.
Right.
Because Yeshua quoted from Torah in his application
Right.
of Matthew 22:36 through 40. I asked the second question, did Yeshua introduce commands to replace those previously given? We know that he is the Word who came in the flesh, that the Word that was spoken of the Father, by the Father, through the Son, to the Son, and now given to you and I if we're born of his Spirit, is that one and self-same Word.
Amen.
I asked the third question, what if Yeshua replaced the commands previously given? That would then prove him to be a false Messiah, that he was not sinless. If he was doing away with the commands that were given originally, instituting a whole new set, then he is not the one that is prophesied in those scriptures, the sinless atoning sacrifice, the Lamb of Yahweh.
Amen.
He is actually a false prophet and a dreamer, and according to Deuteronomy 13 that we read from, he was to be done away with. Now, the Jews, on the other hand, believe that's why he was crucified,
Exactly.
that he was leading people away from their Torah.
Wow.
See that?
Yeah.
That they actually believe that's why he was impaled, and rightly so, they say, because he was leading people away from the words, when in fact they were the ones who, by adding to the word of Yahweh and subtracting from the word of Yahweh, were the very ones who were leading people away from the word of Yahweh.
That's an interesting thing when you consider that, because the basis for professing believers is that the Messiah came and he died and rose again that we might be saved.
Yeah.
But yet they believe that he's lawless.
Yeah.
And the ones that they would say that killed him, they would say crucified him, they did it because they believed he was lawless.
Yeah.
Both sides believe he's lawless. That is an astounding thing to consider.
You think about it.
Yeah.
Even today. I mean, that's the same exact thing that's going on today. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you follow along and aren't really doing that according to his word, he said, it's the blind leading the blind,
Amen.
and both will fall into a ditch.
Wow.
So the fourth question that I want to ask in regards to Acts chapter 15 is, what do the writers who were involved in this Council of Jerusalem, what do they say? If these four, as we've referred to in Acts 15 verse 20, to abstain from the defilements of idols, to abstain from whoring, to abstain from what is strangled, and to abstain from blood, are the only four,
Right.
then all of their epistles would be filled with applications of how these four are the only ones to embrace.
Right. Because if they were teachers and teaching rightly according to what they believed, if that's what they believed, that would have been it. But is that what we see when we look into the scriptures? Were they teaching those four, or were they actually continuing in the same way that Yeshua did and teaching from the very Torah and prophets that he said he didn't come to destroy?
Well, and that's what is important for us to consider. Let's take, for example, the guy who makes the judgment, James. He said, I judge, and he laid it out this way. Then when he writes an epistle, the epistle of James, he says in that epistle, in reference to the Torah, in verse 22, become doers of the word.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we've already established that the word included that which is from the beginning, not the beginning of Matthew, but the beginning of Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
When Yahweh spoke, he was expressing the word.
Amen.
Okay. So James, going clear back to the beginning, says in verse 22 of chapter 1 of the epistle that he writes, become doers. That means rightly appliers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. Because if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks at his natural face in a mirror, where he looks at himself and goes away and immediately forgets what he is like. But he that looked into the perfect Torah, the perfect law, Torah, that of freedom, and continues in it, not becoming a hearer that forgets, but a doer of the work, this one shall be blessed in his doing, and by implication, in his doing and application of the Torah.
Amen. So
of the word.
So the man that looks at his face in a mirror, that's not looking into the perfect Torah of freedom, is not looking at himself in light of what Torah says. That's why he walks away and forgets. He doesn't know. But if he's looking at his life in light of his belief in the very Torah, the very commands and instructions, literally the instruction of our Father, then that has an impact on one's life.
Yeah.
And that's judging ourselves so that we be not judged.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's not finished there. We want to know what James says. If he's thrown out the Torah, all except the 4 that he listed in Acts 15, then his teachings, I would think, would indicate that very thing.
Exactly.
But that's not what we find. Actually, we find in his epistle, James the epistle, chapter 2, he says in verse 8, if you truly accomplish the sovereign law. Now, there's only one sovereign law that this man would embrace. It wasn't the law of Caesar of his time. According to the Scripture. Now, that's very important. That's very important because up until the time, during the time of his stating this, they didn't have the Scripture of the apostolic writings.
Exactly.
The only Scripture they had was that of the Torah, the prophets, and the writings before Matthew.
Exactly.
Okay. So he says, if you truly accomplish the sovereign law according to the Scripture, and then he quotes from it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And here it is again, this command that a lot of people think is the only one. In doing that, they reject the 4 in Acts 15.